Hello, church. Welcome to this week's message. My name is Henry Loke. This is God's Feeding Station. It's an honor to be with you again this week. We're talking about a future for Israel. We're in Romans 11, verses 11 through 14. I kind of feel like I'm a broken record in some sense because we're kind of going over the same things week by week as Paul is in the book of Romans, but he's trying to drive home the point here about salvation. That's what it's about for Paul. And while he revels in the fact that he's bringing salvation to the Gentiles, his heart is for his people. And he's shown them that, when it comes to Gentiles and Jews and sin and salvation, both are on the same level, the same playing field. Both sin, both are judged guilty in their sin, but through Christ, they have salvation if they choose to accept it. So there is no difference between the two. And last week we talked about how Paul discussed that God had not abandoned Israel even though they've rejected his Messiah. And we showed through Scripture the promises God made, and we showed how in all kind of different cases that God, even though, like from an Old Testament perspective, in ancient Israel before Messiah, they had bowed the knee to Baal and turned from him, turned to idolatry. He still kept his promises, still kept the covenant that he made with the nation of Israel. And we talked about how it went through and Simeon and Anna, when it got to the New Testament, how he kept his promises to them as part of the covenant. All these types of things that show that God has not abandoned the nation. Because while the nation as a whole rejected his Messiah, obviously there are Jews in Israel who accept who Christ is and are saved through his death and resurrection. And so while Israel has rejected, while Israel rejected Messiah, their status as the prodigal son, so to speak, is not permanent. The immediate purpose of this is to bring the message of the gospel and salvation to the Gentiles. And the long-term goal is to make Israel jealous through what the Gentiles now have with God, that relationship they have with God. And this will eventually lead to Israel coming back into the fold. And so we begin with verse 11 today. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Right? The question is, did Israel stumble? Is there stumbling beyond recovery? And we've shown that in the simple fact that God has not abandoned them, then the answer to that question is no, not at all. And this is an important part of the plan of God's salvation. Israel's rejection of Messiah did not catch him off guard. It's not something he did not foresee coming. Again, we talked last week about how Israel, in the fact that some have chosen Christ, some have decided for Christ, that action and decision by them has now prompted action by God to now setting them aside as a remnant for himself. So because of Israel's transgression, which is rejection of Jesus, salvation has now come to the rest of the world. And this is the promise God made to Abraham. Through his descendants, all nations of the world will be blessed. And that's the positive result of this. Again, something that God said would happen all the way back in Deuteronomy. And I will say something that God accounted for before the creation of the world, right? It's now happened. And this is the positive result. Israel transgressed. The message now goes out to the Gentiles. And it's ironic, I guess, in some sense, I think that's the right word. It's ironic that the Great Commission, right, making disciples of all nations, has come about through opposition of God's covenant people. right? Israel. They are opposing Paul at every turn. We've seen this in the daily scripture, and we're in the book of Acts, where you just see the Jews coming seemingly out of the woodwork every time Paul shows up at these towns to preach the gospel. It may be for different reasons. It's money because the tradesmen are afraid that he's going to affect their trade because people aren't coming to them for their idols now because he's preaching the truth. On and on and on. You have the Jews from Asia following him from one town to the next, stirring up trouble for him. But it's through this opposition that the Great Commission is being completed now. And there's irony in that. But the plan is not complete. God will use the success of the Gentile part of the plan of salvation to make Israel jealous and bring them home. And this jealousy kind of works in two directions here with Israel. This jealousy has already caused the Jewish religious leaders and the nation as a whole to persecute those who are preaching the gospel and are faithful in it. Again, Paul started out as a persecutor of the church. The leaders, the religious leaders, out of their fear and jealousy of Jesus, had him crucified, worried about their position and worried that maybe he might cause an insurrection and Rome would be prompted to come in and deal with it, and their freedoms and their power would be taken away. That jealousy of what Jesus preached, because it took power away from them. Jesus' message to the Samaritan woman: you will worship in spirit and in truth. You'll no longer need to go to Israel. It's taking away the sway over the people that the religious leaders have over them. So there's a jealousy and an envy there. And so that jealousy is causing them to persecute the church, but it's also going to cause them to come back. They're going to see the relationship that the Gentiles have with God. It is a relationship that they once had. They're going to desire to get that back, and that's going to cause them to turn and maybe have another look at what Paul's preaching here. Go back to Deuteronomy 32. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. It's something that, again, going back to what I said earlier, this brilliance of God, for lack of a better term, in seeing and knowing what was going to happen and using the failure of Israel, their jealousy of the church and their persecution of it, to now spread the gospel to the world, and then using his relationship with the world and that jealousy of Israel to bring them back into the fold. And this is the wisdom of God here. The sins and rejection of Messiah are not wasted. People could look at this and go, oh, what a waste. Jesus came to Israel. Why? All they did was reject it. What a waste. What a waste of time. What a waste of a life. What a waste of 3 years of ministry. And God's like, no. We're going to use this here. Those seeds have been planted. And you're going to see God over time cultivate that and create a harvest in Israel. And so there's a momentary defeat here on the part of Israel. And through it comes blessings to the rest of the world. But the harvest isn't finished yet. The job is not done yet. And there will be a turning and a realization of truth on the part of Israel, and they will return to the fold. Now, Paul addresses his Gentile audience specifically here in verses 12 and 14, and there's a purpose behind it. But let's read the scripture in, and then we'll talk about it. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. Paul wants the Gentiles to know that while he takes pride in his mission to the rest of the world, his desire is for his people. His desire is for his people to turn back and understand that Jesus is indeed Messiah and that they would be saved from their sin. Because this whole thing with Israel is temporary. It's not done and dusted. And Paul says, look at the blessings that God has brought to the Gentiles. How much more will those blessings be magnified than when Israel turns back and rejoins the vine? How much more bountiful will the harvest be when God's own people, God's covenant people, turn back and accept what they once rejected? And so Paul wants the Gentile audience here in Rome, because that's who he's speaking to, he wants them to understand his inner motivation here. He hasn't forgotten his Jewish heritage, and his ministering to the Gentiles, he's going to use that, he's hoping, in a way that will provide a way back for his people. And so he's hoping to reawaken that desire, that zeal for God that they once had. He says he glories in his ministry in another translation. And he's hoping that Israel will desire now what they're missing. And that is this relationship with God, this close personal contact that they once had. And hopefully they're going to reconsider Christ. They're going to reconsider his words and his ministry and his works and his teachings. And they'll have another look at it. And because he's saying to them, look, you see this relationship that you once had with God? Well, now the Gentiles have it. They now enjoy what you once had. Don't you miss that? Doesn't that drive you to have another look at Jesus? Look at his words. Look at what he said. Look at what he did. Look at how he treated people. Look at the message of hope he gave people. Does that not touch you? Does that not drive a desire in you, my people, to come back to God and reconsider his words and look at what you've lost here? Do you not want that back? Do you not desire that closeness with God again? And Paul understands, just as with the Gentiles, not all of Israel will be saved. Some will turn. Some will reconsider. Some will see that, maybe they were wrong. And that this Jesus really had truth and hope and love and salvation in his words and in his works. And so after the tragedy of rejecting Messiah comes the hope, right? Israel has become callous. We talked about that last week. She's now callous in her attitude towards God and towards Jesus. And the Gentiles, in just simple recognition of what God has done for them, that out of his love and his grace and his mercy, he sent his son. And if the God of the universe loved them that much to do that for them, they could indeed trust him with everything. And so they now have the relationship with God that Israel once had. But the time's coming. The time is coming where the callousness on the hearts of Israel will wear away. And it's going to be this envy and jealousy of what the Gentiles now have with God that's going to do that. It's going to start to kind of pick off the callus on their heart and start to let understanding and truth filter back in. open their hearts to understand, and open their eyes to see, and open their ears to hear. And Israel will once again desire what they once had. And both Jews and Gentiles will be gathered together eventually under the banner of Christ. And that's the beauty of this. This plan was set in place in all circumstances considered long before the creation of the world. And so the love of God and his plan of salvation will not be defeated.